So I'm assuming that most people have at least heard of Lincoln Laboratory. What I would like to see, though, is by a show of hands, how many people have either been to the laboratory or have done business with the laboratory? All right, that's actually pretty good. So for those of you who have not, hopefully I'll help teach you a little bit more about what we do, and hopefully you'll find stuff that we're willing to collaborate on, because that is part of what we want to do. We want to collaborate. For those of you who have been to the lab or have done business with us, please feel free to correct me if I misstate anything. All right, so let's try the little clicker here. All right, before I begin, I want to set this in context. So everything we do in terms of geospatial intelligence kind of falls into this loop. And our keynote this morning, Dr. Gilbert, did a very nice job of talking about how we observe information, we evaluate it, and then we make something out of it at IBM. It's kind of a similar process. So what we do, we start with data, all types of data. And the amount of data is just increasing. We all know that. We will never get to a point as a community where we say, we don't need any more data, we're good. It's never going to get there. So what we do is we then want to extract information out of the data. Right now, that's a very manual, labor-intensive process. Those of us in the research community are really working hard to get automated processes to make that job a little bit easier. All that information then goes to an analyst. What the analyst really does, they try and combine that information. They try and make knowledge out of it. They fuse that information, they correlate that information, and then they give that knowledge ultimately to somebody who's going to make a decision on it. And right now, the people making those decisions are still humans. We think that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. And then that decision maker may get to a point where they say, I need a little more information, I need a little more data. And that feeds back into kind of the tasking and collection process. So that's how the whole geospatial intelligence process is done today. The future is going to be a lot more challenging. So the amount of data is just going to continue to increase, especially with the addition of a bunch of open source data and cyber data. We're at the point where a lot of our systems are now talking to other systems. So it's this whole system of systems concept. We're working right now on having manned platforms interface with unmanned platforms as part of a collaborative team. How do we do that? And we need to get to a point where we can have a variety of unmanned systems, small, lightweight ones, operating as a swarm. So how do we, the geospatial intelligence community, deal with all these challenges? This is really difficult stuff. So within that context, I'll talk about what Lincoln Laboratory is, what we're doing, everything with kind of this context around it. All right, so I'll start with a broad brush overstroke of the lab. I'm in the ISR and Tactical Systems division, so I'll talk a little bit about my division. And then specifically with the group I run, I'll give 2 case studies, one that's dealing with the fusion of different types of open source data, and another case study on applying deep learning to image exploitation. So Lincoln Lab has been around for about 65 years. We were formed in 1951. So we've had a variety of very promising successes over the years. So one of the ones that I like to highlight, which not many people know about, in the top row, kind of second from the right side over there. Lincoln Laboratory was actually where Ivan Sutherland did a lot of his research. So Ivan Sutherland, those of you I think know, was one of the founders of 3D graphics, went on to form Evans and Sutherland. He did his research at our shop. So we get to have the claim to fame of having the first computer software program that generated 3D graphics. We get the claim to fame of having the first graphical user interface. So those were all researched and invented by Dr. Sutherland. He also invented the first helmet-mounted display, which is called the Sword of Damocles. If you've never looked at this, search Sword of Damocles online. It's fascinating stuff. So Lincoln Lab was also where the first television picture was transmitted via satellite, first transmission of packetized speech, first radars looking up and getting images of satellites, and down in the lower, from your right, the lower right corner, we did the first demonstration very recently of doing laser communications to a satellite in orbit around the moon. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Our origins, again, in '51, were really started as a spin-out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to focus on one particular mission, which is the protection of the United States against the Soviet strategic bomber threat during the Cold War. So this was development with a lot of radar systems all networked together in a system called the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, SAGE. So even in the early 50s, it was all about creating autonomous systems that can augment the human decision process. Little other factoid of info. A lot of people have heard of the MITRE Corporation. Not everyone realizes that MITRE is actually a spinoff of Lincoln Laboratory. So MITRE was spun off of Lincoln in '58 and has been doing great work ever since. Okay, so we are part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We are part of MIT. The difference, MIT is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, across the river from Boston. That's where the college is. That's where all the unclassified research is done. We, Lincoln Laboratory, are located on Hanscom Air Force Base in Lexington, Massachusetts, about a half-hour northwest of campus. Lexington, if you're not familiar with it, is where the American Revolution started with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So we're very proud of our heritage and our patriotism in the city of Lexington. So Lincoln, we really have one mission, which is very simple to describe. We do technology and support and national security. And we focus really in 3 different areas. We do a lot of analysis and system architecture engineering, some of the big studies and designs. We do long-term strategic technology development, multiple years, 5 years, 10 years, from nascent ideas on technology to actually getting proof of concepts out there. And where we really pride ourselves, we do a lot of prototyping. We build stuff. We do prototypes, we do demos. And once we get something out there and working, part of our mission is to do technology transfer of those prototypes. So we may build, single-digit, onesies and twosies of physical devices, and then we transition it to industry. Sometimes we transition it to other government laboratories to do the sustainment, but most of the time we transition to industry. So we've got 8 different divisions at the laboratory. You see them up there. So I don't have time to talk about some of the ones that are doing great work, but not quite so much GEOINT. So we've got a microchip fabrication laboratory. We do a lot of work in biotech. We've got a flight facility with our own fleet of aircraft. I won't be talking about those today, so I'll touch on some of the divisions that are related to GEOINT. So the first one I'll talk about is a division we have that focuses on air and missile defense. So we do a lot of support for the Navy here, a lot of great work doing radar signal processing, a lot of work doing sonar signal processing. A lot of times what we do, we'll work with existing systems to modernize them. So one of the ones here is the E2C Hawkeye radar. So at the laboratory, we have essentially a design pattern where we'll take an existing system, we instrument the data that comes in and out of it, we run new algorithms, new architectures on that data. It's alongside the existing system, it doesn't get in the way of it. And that design pattern we've had for about 30 years, we call it a sidecar. So there's a lot of aspects of what we do with these sidecar design patterns. The other one, which is kind of a very interesting project, it's called the Flyaway Sensor Package. And what this does, during ballistic missile tests, it releases alongside the system under test, and it has sensors and thrusters on it to orient it so it can look at and image the payload that's being tested, and it creates a video of that. So it's really some fascinating stuff going on in that division. The other one, we have a division focused on homeland protection and air traffic control. Now, the air traffic control side has been around for many, many years, and the image up in the upper right, all of us who took an aircraft to fly down here, hopefully you're the benefactors of some of the early research. There's a system called TCAS, the Terminal Collision and Avoidance System. So this is when 2 aircraft are approaching each other. If they're on a collision course, the system tells one to decrease altitude, the other to increase. That was invented at Lincoln Lab. The other one in the Homeland Defense area, Lincoln did the initial prototype development of a system around the nation's capital that protects the Washington, D.C. area, the national capital region. In terms of Homeland Defense, or Homeland Security, we've been working a lot more in terms of disaster response. So we've prototyped a system, and it's out in the field being used, so that first responders have a better opportunity to communicate with each other. So in terms of the intelligence, it's all about situational awareness. They need to know where all of the firefighters are. They need to know where forest fires are. So we were working very closely with the California Wildfire Division, the CAL FIRE, developing this. More recently, we have a division that was started up focusing on cybersecurity. So this is all aspects of that challenge, both in terms of defensive cyber, offensive cyber, analysis and studies, and looking at what are the vulnerabilities of system to reverse engineering. So one of the projects that I'll highlight here, there's a system that we've developed working with a couple of the COCOMs called CloudBreak. And the thing I want to point out here, those of us in the geospatial community often take for granted our ability to visualize data. It's what we do. You know, every talk you're going to see throughout the conference, you're going to have some great eye candy, because we do that. We visualize stuff. In the cyber realm, it's much harder. How do you give a cyber commander a common operational picture of what it means in the cyber world? So that's some of the research areas that we're working on. That's kind of what the focus of some of that is. Our communication system has been around for a very long time, doing great work. And what I want to talk about here is some of our laser comm technology. Can we get next slide? Thank you. All right, so as I said in the brief overview, we built a system to do laser communications to a satellite orbiting the moon. So a couple things I want to point out about this. The payload that Lincoln created is this little gold thing on the side of this NASA satellite. And as we built it, we were working with NASA, and NASA didn't want to have any sort of connection between their payload and the Lincoln laser payload. We eventually convinced them, hey, at least put an Ethernet cable between the two. You never know what you're really going to want to have happen once it's up in orbit. So this was launched back in 2013, and fairly quickly after that, we established Comlink, and we were able to get the laser comms between the Earth and the satellite orbiting the moon working really, really well at about 622 megabits per second. And shortly thereafter, the folks at NASA said, hey, this RF downlink that we have isn't really all that fast. You know that cable you installed? Can we use your link? So our laser link ended up being the primary method by which the data from the satellite was getting downlinked. Earlier today, I think it was Charlotte from Aptima had talked about the space surveillance network and some of the challenges with that. Lincoln's been a big player in that for many, many, many years. So both in terms of radar technology, in terms of some of the optical telescopes, we run and maintain and support the SSN, the Space Surveillance Network. Another little factoid I'll point out, that SAGE system that I mentioned at the beginning, what the lab was built for doing protection against Soviet strategic bombers, that was also the system that when the Soviets launched Sputnik, those radars were repurposed to get the first detection of Sputnik. So in the optical aspect of what we do here, there's a very large telescope that was recently built out on Adam Peak at White Sands Missile Range to do surveillance of space with this very large high-power telescope. One of the things that's very interesting about this, we tried to really simplify the optics on it. It's just got 3 lenses, but because of that, the detection surface is actually a curved detector. In terms of the radar surveillance for this, there's a system not quite in Lexington, a little bit farther down the road on Millstone Hill. And we recently updated one of the radars out there. So these are systems that do imaging of satellites to kind of help with that space surveillance, help maintain custody of all the objects up there, whether it's satellites or whether it's space junk. So the center image down there is the prior radar, which was an X-band radar. The new image is W-band. The other thing I want to point out, I tend to be a software guy, and I'm amazed at some of the stuff that mechanical engineers can do in general. So the dish on this radar is 120 feet in diameter, so 40 yards, almost half the length of a football field. And the tolerance on that radar dish needed to be within 100 microns to work, 1/10 of a millimeter. So a couple pictures of the upgrade of this. So this is taking the radome apart as part of the radar upgrade. And then this is an image of that new W-band radar system. So again, within 1/10 of a millimeter across 120-foot diameter. Okay, a little more about the division that I'm in, the ISR and Systems division, ISR and Tactical Systems. So we really focus on three primary areas. We do systems architecture and analysis. There's a group called the Air Force Red Team, which has been around for about 38 years, which is in our division, looking at vulnerabilities of the US Air Force systems, as well as how best to employ those systems. We've got a part of our division that does a lot of exploitation work, both in terms of signal processing, so those initial phases of extracting information from the data, as well as the C2 PED systems, how to combine all that information to get the knowledge out of it. And then we've got a lot of research going on in terms of just advanced technology. So both in terms of sensors and in terms of some of the analytics. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to highlight 2 sensors that have been developed recently and 2 analytics that we've got ongoing research on. So in terms of sensors, there's an infrared system that's been developed called WISP, Wide Area Infrared System for Persistent Surveillance. There's really been 2 primary modes where this has been employed. One of them is mounted on a pole, rotating 360 degrees to provide protection for forward operating bases. What I'm going to show today is the use of that same system employed in an aircraft. So this is a wide area motion imagery system, a WAMI system. And the differences between WAMI and your typical full motion video or FMV is really your area of regard. So WAMI has just a much larger coverage area on the ground than your typical full motion video from an MQ-9 Predator, or MQ-9 Reaper or an MQ-1 Predator. WAMI systems typically are built one of 2 ways. You either have multiple cameras that collect the image at the same time, and then it's all stitched together, or you have one camera that does a lot of scanning of the scenes, and then you have a lot of signal processing to get one coherent image. And WISP is the latter. So I've got a couple little animations here. So part of it is a one-dimensional scan. And then that goes into gimbal, and the gimbal starts scanning. And these 2 combined are how you get your large area coverage. So I'll show you another close-up view of some of the data collected by this. Let's do next slide, please. And go ahead and do one advance on this. So this is a collect from 2 years back in the Boston area. So one of the highlights is downtown Boston. The other one is MIT campus. And again, this is a nighttime view, so this is all infrared data. So we're seeing a ship leaving Boston Harbor. We're seeing some vehicles outside MIT, and it's about 45 centimeter resolution. The other sensor I want to talk about is a system called Machete. So earlier this morning, there was a question to one of the speakers, I think a question for Sandia, about foliage penetrating radar. How do you do FOPEN? So Machete was built to solve some of those issues. Now, I'm not going to sit there and say that this actually penetrates leaves. It does not. It's laser, it's a light, it can't go through a leaf. But it goes around leaves and through canopies. So if you've ever gone for a walk in the woods, in any sort of forest, even if it's triple canopy, rainforest, it's not pitch black. It's not totally dark, there's always light coming through. So there's little holes between all the leaves in there that light gets through. So with this system, what it's able to do is it rotates, circles an area, sends the laser energy out, and the detections can detect even just down to the 1 photon level. And from that, you get a 3-dimensional point cloud, a bunch of voxels, that give you a bunch of height information about the area you're observing. So the system we've had running on a Dash 8, and with a lot of these LiDAR systems, the volume of data collected is so large that you really can't transmit it to the ground while you're collecting it. So most of these are the type of systems where you collect it, you land, you offload the data, you do your exploitation on the ground. So I'll give you a quick little look at what the quality of this data is. So let's go ahead and, there we go, perfect. So this is some data collected. This is over the city of Boston. So again, all of this is just laser energy that was transmitted, reflected, and sent back. So one of the challenges, once you've got this 3-dimensional point cloud, is how do you extract information out of it? So let's go ahead and quit the movie and get back to the presentation, please, if we may. So there's a bunch of different algorithms that can be run. So first of all, what you want to do, you want to extract that base Earth layer. So I've got all this different height data. You can extract and derive what the underlying ground layer is. Once you've got that, you can start looking for man-made objects. So planar surfaces, linear features, things like that don't often show up in nature on their own. So once you've extracted the canopy away, you basically just set your thresholds and essentially eliminate the trees. You can start seeing a lot of these man-made features. Okay. So going forward on this, so the group I run is the Intelligence and Decision Technologies group. We're essentially the processing, exploitation, and dissemination, the PED group at the laboratory. We really focus on 3 different areas. One of them is the development and research into open architectures. And one of the projects we've got underway there is looking at the modernization of the Air Force Distributed Common Ground System, the Air Force DCGS system. So we did some of the early prototyping and proof of concepts of this open architecture DCGS. Over the past year, we've been working very closely with our colleagues at the Air Force Research Labs up in Rome, New York, who've extended and enhanced the prototype. And they're working on getting this deployed for an operational pilot with the Air Force in later this summer, early fall. Again, our keynote this morning, Dr. Gilbert talked about the importance of observing the users. So I've got a very strong team of people with a background in operations research that look at how do you optimize the GEOINT ISR enterprise. And part of that is you just go and work alongside people, see how they do their job. You observe them. And then you make recommendations. So those recommendations may be different technology areas that we need to invest in. Those recommendations may be, what are different procedures on how you do your work? So that's a big part. What I'll be talking about for the rest of this is the group that's working on advanced algorithm development. So we do a lot of artificial intelligence work, machine learning, pattern recognition, and fusion and decision support. So the first research project I'll talk about that's underway is fusing different types of open source intelligence. And again, there was a question, why is a government lab working on exploiting OSINT? So no, contrary to what my kids may think, I'm not trying to figure out if they tell me they're going to the movies, are they really going to the movies or not? What we're doing is something more important for national security. Nation states tend to have separate infrastructure for their command and control networks. Terrorist networks do not. So terrorist networks tend to use the open source environment, social media, that is their command and control infrastructure. So whether that's the open internet or whether it's the dark web, that's what they use. So what we're trying to do is come up with methods that we can better exploit those command and control networks. So a lot of what we do for research, we have smaller data sets. But all of it is trying to get the information out of the data and fuse it to get some of that knowledge. So with any particular type of social media platform, there's information you can get out of it, which is good, useful information, and I know a lot of folks in industry are working on it, which is awesome. What we're trying to do, though, is make those correlations between different platforms. And so when you start fusing that data, different patterns can start to show up. So we'll go through an example of how to do that. So we started with a data set. Next slide, please. So started with a data set that applies several different technologies for how to do that fusion. So certain aspects are relatively straightforward. You can look at someone's login account name on one social media platform, and you can do extrapolations and correlate that to account names on other platforms. You can look at the people who are connected to me on one social media platform are probably the same people that are connected to me on a different social media platform. And especially on Twitter, you can look at a temporal analysis. So a lot of times, accounts will get shut down on Twitter, and a new account will pop up. So you're playing whack-a-mole all the time, trying to follow these users around. And what you can do is you can look for the patterns, the temporal patterns, on when different activity gets posted onto that account, and you can start making some correlations between that, as well as just the spatial correlation. Spatial correlation is probably the easiest of all these. So what we did, we started looking at a sample data set around Lagos, Nigeria. And if there's any Nigerians out here, I'm not saying Lagos is a terrorist hotbed. This was just a sample data set to test some of the algorithms. And so what we started to do is look at how do we correlate this between the different modalities. So let's go ahead and next slide is a movie, so let's get that going, please. So again, all of this is just open source data. And a lot of what we're doing for the correlations and the fusion between the different pieces of information, it's all statistically based. So is it absolute? It's not, but it's trying to get the information out of it. So the first layer we looked at was the pretty simple stuff. So it's geospatially tagged data on Foursquare and Google Places. We then looked at Twitter, and we were doing correlations between similarities of the content that people are talking about on Twitter. Then we looked at a blog that's in Nigeria. This is one of the primary reasons we use this. So there's a blog called Narrowland that just talks about information of interest to people in Lagos. So the challenge was, how do we do the correlation and fusion between these? So we started looking at as was said earlier, the 1% of Twitter, which is geotagged. And so you've got a Twitter geotag, and you can correlate that with the other geospatial data you've got from Foursquare, Google Places. We then look at trying to cross-correlate user accounts from the blog, Narrowland, to the Twitter users. And once you've got that cross-correlation, you can start doing some pretty interesting things. So you essentially end up with this very large graph network. So people have probably heard about graph exploitation, and what do you do with this? Well, once you've got this, you can get some sort of tip queue from one modality, and you can start going down to your different platforms. So if I have a blog entry, and we can exit this and go back to the presentation, please. If we have a blog entry of a user, we can then follow that down to where they might be on Twitter. You can start expanding that exploitation to who are the associates of that person on Twitter, and like I said, start combining these. All right, the next one that I'll talk about is deep learning and applying that to image exploitation. So I'm not going to go and do a big overview on what deep learning is. That would take far too long, and I'm not the expert on it. But what I will point out is deep learning is really a branch of machine learning. It's been an evolutionary thing. It's just within the past few years, there's been some very, very powerful results. So the example I'll give is about 20 years ago, I think at this point, is when IBM's Deep Blue defeated the chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov at a game of chess. So I think their first competition was in '96, and Deep Blue lost. They had a rematch the next year in '97, and Deep Blue ended up winning. So in the interim, a lot of work has been going on a different game. So there's this Chinese game called Go. It's been around for between 2,500 and 4,000 years. And those of you that are in the research community that are aware of this, it's generally agreed that Go is a much more complicated game than chess. The board is a 19 by 19 grid, and there's just much more options available in the moves. So Google, very recently, in October of this year, had created a software program called AlphaGo. And AlphaGo was a deep learning system to play the game of Go. And so what Google did is they trained it. They trained it based on a bunch of games that a bunch of amateur humans had played. And then they told AlphaGo, start playing matches against yourself. So the system started doing that, and it tended to learn all these different variations of it. So then AlphaGo, in October, ended up defeating one of the world premier humans of the game of Go. So it's very interesting and very powerful that you can do this. So why hasn't this been adopted across the board? Well, like I said, until recently, within the past few years, these machine learning systems have had just very poor performance, either in terms of the algorithms or there just wasn't really the hardware backend to support it. The other one is an area of active research, which is building trust in these systems. A lot of times now, you'll get a deep learning system that'll present a result, and you just don't know why it chose that. It's really, really hard to get that trust to come out. So again, I challenge you in the audience, figuring out how to build that trust and how to get a human to understand why the computers are making those decisions is a very important area. The third one is the one that I'm going to focus on in the last part of my presentation here, which is how do you get one of these systems to adapt to new challenges? So things like AlphaGo, great system, a really good deep learning system, but that's kind of just what it does. So how do you get a system that you've trained on a lot of data to be able to get little bits of new data and adapt to those new challenges? So I'm going to start by looking at the current way we exploit data. So again, data comes in of all different types and sources. So you may have imagery data, you may have full motion video data, you may have signals intelligence data, lots of data. And right now, today, a person exploits that data, and they're an expert in that type of data. So someone who's exploiting imagery is not also going to exploit video. They're not going to exploit SIGINT. They're their image expert. So you get a bunch of these single source analysts that do excellent, wonderful work, creating information out of the data. And that information then goes to another person who's the all source analyst. And that person tends to combine all that information, creates knowledge, gives it to a decision maker. So this project that I've had going on in my group for a little under a year now is called Computer on Watch. And the goal is to apply these deep learning techniques to develop automated assistance throughout the process. So we're not talking about replacing people. So let me give you a concrete example of some of the benefits of this. Every image that gets collected has at least one set of eyeballs that look at it. Often many, many sets of eyeballs, but at least one. And that person is a data screener. All they're doing is looking at the image. Is this decent quality? Is there a cloud obscuring what I'm trying to observe? But there's always at least one pair of eyeballs. So we think that computer vision and deep learning are at the point where you could pretty easily these days build a computer vision system to do that first level data triage. So get the computer to do the data triage, let the analyst do the exploitation. So that's kind of where we're working on. So as I said, deep learning is showing some very, very promising results. It tends to be trained on large amounts of data. Some of that training is computer-assisted training. Some of it is a manual process, but it's lots of training data. The challenge is how to get the system to learn with little bits of new data. So how does the system adapt? So that's really where the focus of our research on this is. I'll go on a slight technical tangent here and talk a little bit about what really is deep learning. So it's really, you've got different features in your data set that you're trying to look at. So you may have one part of an image processing system that looks at edge detection of images, another layer that looks at pixel intensity of the images. And you get a bunch of these, bunch of feature layers, and it's the process of combining them in the recognition phase, which is what makes these powerful these days. So there's an algorithm called convolutional neural network, CNNs, so we're applying CNNs to this problem. The challenge, though, like I said, how do you train the system? So I'll walk you through an example on how that's done. So we start with an image, you apply these sort of CNNs to it, and it'll start by recommending a region that should go on through the further part of the pipeline. So up on the top, there's a bunch of airplanes outlined in gray. Those are the regions that the algorithm has said, these are objects that I think need to be classified. So it goes through this iterative process of detecting all the objects, and then it sends those objects further on. So the first thing you do, so you'll see an airplane outlined in yellowish orange. It then projects that. So most computer recognition deep learning systems right now, they take the image and they project it to be vertically and horizontally aligned. It's easier to do the ID that way. And then after that region has been projected, it's passed on to a classifier. And that classifier then looks at that image against the various pieces of trained data and comes up with a recommended result on what it thinks it is. So the goal is to have a computer assistant like this doing this first level data triage, looking at images like the ones at the bottom here and identifying where are all the aircraft, where are all the ships, where are all the vehicles, and doing it at an object level, not at a pixel level. So the challenge with something new is how do you do this? So The research we've got going on here has about, I don't know, half a dozen or so categories or classes of data. You've got aircraft, helicopters, various ships, various vehicles. So what happens when the computer sees something it hasn't seen previously? So in the Boston area, there's a lot of construction going down around the Seaport District, so there's a lot of construction cranes. So the example I walk through here is our machine learning system sees a construction crane. What does it do? Well, the first thing it does, it'll go through the region, do the projection, and then goes through the classification stage. And it tries to match it against one of these classes. So it may pick, say, a semi-tractor trailer as the class that the crane matches. But the thing we're doing is we're keeping a similarity metric. So the system will say, I think this is a semi-tractor trailer truck, but then we compare that against all of the other semi-tractor trailer trucks in the class, and we get a metric. And it says, how similar is this new object to what I've seen previously? And that's when we then present this to the analyst. And the analyst can say, yep, it really is a semi-tractor trailer. Extend your knowledge of the class, since things like this are semi-tractor trailers. Or the analyst can say, huh, I've not seen that before. I like that. That's a new type of object. So you now don't really need a lot of training data for that new object. You've just told the system this is new. It's not one of those classes. And that's how at least we're purporting, hypothesizing we'll be able to extend the system. OK, so the future vision for this machine learning stuff is really 3 areas. Getting these computer-generated assistants that can help with the data triage, that kind of low-hanging fruit. Combining information into knowledge for some of this higher-level reasoning. Again, low-hanging fruit on this, even if we can get it just to do some of the change detection at the object level. So I monitor, ships in port and how many ships are normally there, how many ships are there today, and cueing the analyst that something's a little bit different. And then getting a system that can continuously learn and adapt to new environments. All right, and with that, I've got a real quick summary. So Lincoln, we are a federally funded research and development center in FFRDC. We've been around since '51. We've got a lot of expertise in a bunch of geospatial intelligence areas. Hopefully, I've given you a little bit of information on what some of those are. One of our strong points is rapid prototyping and doing demonstrations and doing that tech transfer back to industry. And a lot of the underlying technologies in artificial intelligence have really evolved to the point where I think it's really going to start to revolutionize what those of us in this community do on a regular basis. So with that, I'm ready to take some questions if there are any.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So I'm going to go with the first most specific question. Get that out of the way. So is your lab involved with the U.S. Next Generation Air Transport System via ADS-B or otherwise? Does anybody know what that means other than the guy that wrote it?
Yeah, it's a public source transponder.
Aha.
So I would love to answer that. I just don't have the information on it. I know we've got a group that's been working with the FAA, so I'm positive we're working with ADS-B at some point. I just don't know to what extent.
OK, great. So Director Cardillo often, I guess when he came in, he talked about putting your content in context in order to convey for consequence. For the R&D community, it almost seems like there's 2 communities inside the R&D community. One focused on generating exquisite content, right? Better, faster, harder, further away, better resolution, whatever it is. Then there's the people that focus on putting it in context, finding meaning, and you talked a bit at the end about the machine learning. Can you talk about how that manifests inside Lincoln Labs? Are they literally 2 different sets of folks? Is it 2 different pots of money? Is it a yin and a yang? Is it some sort of a pendulum that goes back and forth?
Right.
Because it does sometimes seem like a schizophrenia that's out there. Every time we get a faster, better, stronger sensor, then all of a sudden we pour a bunch of money into putting it into context.
Right. So at least with us, it tends to be 2 different groups of people. It's a relatively simple delineation. We tend to have a lot of hardware people that work on the sensors. We have a lot of software people that work on the exploitation of it. The one challenge that there still is, and whether it's an airborne sensor, whether it's space, is we're still unfortunately at a point where a lot of times we build these sensors without thinking about how are we going to exploit it, what is the PED systems. And so we'll build these exquisite sensors, and then after the fact, we're trying to figure out how do we make sense of the data it collects. So we tend to have different groups set up that focus on it, but we work in conjunction with each other.
WISP? WISP?
Yeah, the wide area.
There we
infrared.
go.
Yep.
Can WISP be used for real-time change detection for tactical deployment?
Yes. A lot of times, like I said, the ground-based one, we've got it deployed, half a dozen or so units, sitting on a pole, doing 360-degree surveillance around fobs, and it is doing vehicle tracking of the data in real time.
Okay. Keep referring to the directors of NGA since we're here at the GEOINT Symposium. So both Director Long and Director Cardillo have talked a lot about anticipatory intelligence.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about deep learning, you talk about active learning, and it seems like there's some continuum there, right? As we deploy these new ways of contextualizing our observations and trying to learn, develop some understanding from them. It's one thing to be able to adapt our models to change as it occurs. It's another thing to be able to anticipate change, black swan events, things
right.
like that. How do you guys think about that?
Sure. So for years, that the community has been dealing with the geospatial aspect of data, just where things are. More recently, the temporal aspect has really started to come into play. So it may be one thing to see a coordinate where something's happening, but does that normally happen on a Monday or on a Thursday, at 3 in the morning, at 6 at night? So coming up with algorithms that start looking at patterns of life in the temporal space, not just in the geospatial realm, I think is where you can really start getting to some of that anticipatory intelligence. So whether you're trying to not be observed or to observe someone else, knowing when things happen is equally as important as knowing where they happen.
So when you first started, you talked about actively being interested in engaging with the folks out here. So how do the folks out here engage Lincoln Labs? Do they just run up to the fence line with the armed guard and right. show their PowerPoint deck? Or?
So one of our advantages, like I said, we are part of MIT, so I think we have a little more flexibility for reaching out to a broader community. Recently, Lincoln Laboratory opened a facility on campus, so there's a laboratory there where we can very easily do a lot of collaboration with people. That is a little bit of a play on words on Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, so MIT's mascot is the beaver, so it's the Beaver Works facility on MIT campus. Sorry.
And then last question is, you talked a lot about transitioning the fruits of your research out to industry.
Yeah.
How does that often manifest, and maybe could you give us an example or two?
Sure, I'll give 2 examples. So a lot of what we do, like I said, we're trying to share stuff with the community, enable the community. So there's 2 broad categories, I'd say. There's certain projects that have certain restrictions within the government, and other ones which have no restrictions. So the ones that have some restriction, we've been working a lot with a system that the NRO maintains called Defense Intelligence Information Enterprise, DITUI. So DITUI.net is actually a very good way for the government to collaborate and share source code and documentation. So we've got projects that post all our source code up on DITUI.net. We've also got a lot more projects that are beginning underway that we just released to the open source community. So in terms of some of the natural language processing, we have one of the state-of-the-art named entity extractors, this thing called MIT Entity Extractor, MIghty. And so that's just released as open source. It's on GitHub.
Fantastic. Please let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.